So, can the resurrection be studied historically? Let's just look and say, is this even something we can do? Right? Remember, we studied, we said like the divinity of Christ, you can't really study using the historical critical method. The humanity of Christ, yeah, we can find out about Christ, about his humanity, including what his humanity might have thought about his divinity, right? Anyway, this is a similar question. Can we even study this historically? Right? It does seem to be a divine act. He is risen from the dead. Luke Timothy Johnson says no, not really, right? Because when he's resurrected, he's not part of the world of history anymore because he transcends time and space. He's like beyond that. One way some people sometimes talk about it is when he was resurrected, right? He went everywhere. So he's in all time, he's in all space. You can't really say, oh, okay, let's talk about him in a historical context. Let's talk about the resurrected Christ in a specific time and place because he transcends that. So it's not really an appropriate method. But Luke Timothy Johnson will say there was an experience. What we do have historically is that we can say that the real human community, right, of the early Christians, they did experience the risen Christ. And they did claim that he was risen from the dead. And that changed their lives. That experience changed their lives and also changed the lives of people today. It also guides people today. So he says that's what's important about the risen Christ. And that's really what we should be spending our time looking at, not trying to analyze it historically. He finds that inappropriate. Albo, on the other hand, is more than willing to look at the resurrection as a historical event and see what we can know about it historically. And he starts by looking at the two claims of early Christians. He says, well, okay, he agrees with Johnson that we have this claim of the historical Christians, that they really did believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. They had an experience that caused them to believe that, and it changed the way they lived their lives. It moved them to action, right? Just like it does for people today. So Abel says, okay, let's look at the beliefs of those early Christians. And he starts with the claim that the tomb was empty. Now, this is in all the Gospels. So it looks like it has so people will say, hey, it's in every Gospel, that therefore there's a better chance that it's an actual event because you have more documentation or more reports of it. Second of all, if we look at one of the other methods we use in the historical critical method, embarrassment, right? Abel points out that the stories in the Gospels, these multiple attestations, have the women going to the tomb, finding it empty, and then having that experience of some kind of angelic beings telling them that Christ has risen from the dead. So that empty tomb is an important part of the claims. It's really what opens the whole resurrection question up and opens people's minds to the possibility of it and then later the experience of it. So Abel says, like, why would they make up a story in which such an important element, finding the empty tomb, was witnessed by women when, and sorry women and men, sorry humans, when in that time women were not seen as legitimate or as legitimate legal witnesses. Yeah, sorry, I'm sorry, but that seems to be a fact of the times, that women's witness was not court-worthy because women were not as valued as men. So that's the argument. In other words, this part of the story was not made up, because if it was made up, they would have made up a better story. They would have had some reputable men who would be well believed witnesses, right, to find the empty tomb, not these women. And even Luke reflects this, when he has the women come back. What do the men say? Oh, that's nonsense, right? They don't believe him. That, unfortunately, right, could have been a popular occurrence in that time. So there we have, you understand what I'm saying with the embarrassment clause. If they made the story up, they would have made it up better. They wouldn't have made women be the witnesses of the empty tomb. They would have made it some reputable man or men. And therefore, Abel makes a good point here, I think. That makes that more likely to be a historical event. The second claim is that Jesus appeared to many eyewitnesses in a transformed bodily state. Right? We have these accounts in all the Gospels, and it talks about it in the rest of the New Testament. And he says, well, what can we do? He says there's three options for this. Number one, he says it's an historical event. Right? The people saw, touched the glorified body of Christ. Historically, right? Literalistly, right? Like this was a historical fact. This actually happened. If you had a video camera, you went back in time, you would be able to record this on your phone. That's number one. This was a historical event. This was something that actually happened. Option number two is fabrication. Somebody made it up. Nothing like it happened. Just somehow people told the story and other people started believing it. And then there you go. A lie might be a strong word to use, but it was somehow made up. It was not a historical event. Or number three, he says, they had some kind of visions. The disciples had visions or hallucinations. And they were just visions or hallucinations, but they believed that they were real bodily appearances. And he says it has to be one. These are the three options. Now, first of all, I'm not trying to disable here or Abel here, but again, to me, when someone says there's three options, this, or this, or there's two options, this or that, I always get a little bit suspicious and say, really, is that all there is? It could only be one of those three things. So the line of reasoning he's using here to me is immediately suspect. Now, what Abel says is he goes back to the point where the description of the risen Christ doesn't fit with the beliefs of the time about a resurrection. In other words, it's not a fabrication. He says this is not something people made up, right? Because if they made it up, they wouldn't have made up something so weird, right? They would have made up something that fit with what people believed at the time. It's a rational point he's making, right? However, it's not necessarily true, right? Why couldn't people make up some strange new idea? People do it. It does happen sometimes. All right, the second point, vision he makes, is he says visions or hallucinations were highly implausible because the gospel accounts are designed to rule out that explanation that these events were merely visions or appearances of Jesus Christ, right? So he says, again, they weren't just visions or hallucinations because when the people were describing them, they were specifically describing them in a way to say, hey, these aren't visions or hallucinations. We actually touched him. He actually ate food, right? And so he says, hey, if it wasn't made up, and if it wasn't just a vision that was misunderstood as a real bodily appearance, then it must be a historical event, right? Because remember, he said you only have three options: this one, or this one. And if it's not this one or this one, then it must be this one. Okay, Abel. What he's saying is not irrational, right? He's following a good line of reason. However, I do think he's coming with a little prejudice here. So here in this orange type is my critique of Abel. So first thing he says is like, it couldn't be a vision because, or it wasn't fabricated because it doesn't match up with a way that people would talk about resurrection at the time. Well, what if they had a vision, right? That inspired them to think about the resurrection in some new way. Then couldn't they have shared their new vision with others? And then become some new way to talk about a resurrection experience? Or, what if like they hallucinated touching and seeing the resurrected body? And so the way that their vision or hallucination was led them to believe that there was actually a tangible body there, right? So what if they actually thought that it really happened? Then wouldn't they report it that way, right? And share it with people that way? Now, I realize this brings up a whole larger question of what does it mean to experience something? I mean, if 3 or 4 people have the same hallucination, did it really happen for those 3 or 4 people? Is it real, right? Or is that a hallucination because maybe, another 3 or 4 people that were there didn't see it or didn't experience it, didn't have that same experience? This is really bring up the question of the subjective and objective nature of reality. But we're not going to go too far into that. But what I'm just going to say is, I think I would agree be more in the camp of Luke Timothy Johnson, that you really can't study this using the historical critical method. We really can't say, well, they must have actually touched this glorified body, right? For the reasons Abel says, that's not an option. So though I respect Abel's opinion here, I think he is kind of being a little bit prejudiced on the side of believing it, right? If he's going to say, let's reserve ourselves to using the historical critical method, right? So you see both, Wright, Abel, Luke Timothy Johnson, they all believe in the resurrection of Christ. But Luke Timothy Johnson doesn't think it's something that can be studied by the historical critical method. Abel seems to think it does, but I got to be a little bit critical of him here and saying, I think that he's kind of using some faulty logic, right? There is more than 3 options. It's not just this, or it has to be this. So if we can't, again, it seems to be one of those things that really is divine in nature, and therefore we can't really study it using contemporary scientific methods or the historical critical method. The resurrection of Christ was an experience that they had. So here's the way I would sum it up. We can't tell the exact nature of the early Christians' experience of the risen Christ using the historical critical method, but we can see that they did have an experience, right? Something happened. They experienced the risen Christ in some weird, profound way. If we start off, what do we see after the crucifixion? They're hiding, they're running away, right? They are not enthusiastic about Jesus. Matter of fact, they're scared that they're going to get in trouble for being associates of Jesus. And we see in Luke the disciples running away to Emmaus, right? Then, while they're sitting there hiding or running away, all of a sudden things turn around. And they suddenly start going out into the street, proclaiming the resurrection of Christ publicly. And they sell all they have, and they form this new community based on their beliefs in the risen Christ. And again, they're publicly proclaiming Christ rose from the dead, and they're changing the whole way they live their lives. So something happened. They had an experience of the risen Christ, and it wasn't something mundane. It seemed to be something profound. You know, something strange and life changing happened. And I think that's about all we can really say using the historical critical method. I think if we try to comment more than that, then we're overreaching, and we're not doing this based on the historical critical method anymore. We're going into faith. We're going to what we believe, which is great for our beliefs, but we have to recognize, right? Again, going back to the difference between faith and science, right? Science and the historical critical method is a kind of scientific method. It can tell us about the things that are tangible, the things that are sensible, the things we can hear, right? It can tell us about the things that we can sense with our senses. But it can't tell us about things that we might know in some subtle ways, right? So again, our faith should be supported by reason and should not be contrary to reason. But part of that is not overstepping the bounds of reason either, and being honest when something like the nature of the experience of the risen Christ is a matter of faith. It's something that they experience for themselves, and it's something on some level, if we believe it, we take their word, but we also have our own personal experience. So it's not like a math fact we can prove, but it's something more profound than that, because it's a belief that we're invited to believe in and we're invited to experience for ourselves.